Thank you very much for waiting. Thank you for coming. This is the concluding press conference of the 71st session of the General Assembly. And without further ado, let me introduce the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Peter Thomson, to make some remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry to have kept you all waiting. The SDG event, which we've been having all morning, is still going on. I was supposed to make the closing remarks down there, but I've come up here instead, and Ambassador Williams will do that for me down there. If I have a few regrets, as Frank used to say, one would be that I haven't spent more time talking to you all. As you know, when I started out in this job, I told you all that I used to be a permanent Secretary for Information back in Fiji, back in the 70s, 80s. I do recognize the importance of such meetings and our interaction. But, I wish I'd seen more of my daughter, who lives in Brooklyn, during the year. I wish I'd seen a bit more of my wife, who just lives across the road. It's an incredibly taxing job being President of the General Assembly these days. There's a huge amount of mandates that the General Assembly has put on that office now. And I've been saying to everybody that it's time we rethink the kind of support that's given to the presidency in terms of a permanent staffing of the office. At least we've managed to build in continuity now. In about a third of the staff now seem to be transferring year to year in the President's office, so there is that continuity. But it's still a huge burden for an incoming president to start absolutely from word go with raising funds and raising staff, and then doing this highly important job for the UN system, and then you do it for a year, and then somebody else starts again. I guess I brought upon myself the extra burdens, which I talked to you about at the beginning of the year, mainly that bridging of the two regimes, the Ban Ki-moon regime and the Guterres regime coming in. We were determined that there'd be no valley in the transition, and that's just a normal thing in any corporation or any business or any government, that there's always a bit of a loss of momentum while the old team is saying goodbye and the new team's getting the hang of it. So we were determined that in the case of the Sustainable Development agenda, that would not happen, that we would provide the bridge by getting in a very big and competent team into the office of the President of the General Assembly to bridge that valley. And that job, as was reported today to member states, was, to my best assessment, successfully done, and was certainly acknowledged as such by member states and by the Deputy Secretary General in there at the meeting today. So in claiming success on driving the implementation of the SDGs, because I do think we did get that success, I was also saying in there to the member states that it is clear that while we have now got momentum on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we need greater momentum. We need to scale up. We've only got 13 years left. Time is not on our side. I'm very confident that we have the resources to do the 2030 agenda to its full extent. I have no doubt that this is within humanity's ability. We have the resources, we have the ingenuity. All we really need is better coordination. And when I say better coordination, I'm referring to the private sector in particular. That's where humanity's financial resources and our greatest ingenuity lies, in the private sector around the world. And we have to get the private sector partnering up with governments, particularly in the developing world, where we need to see that SDG implementation, but also in the North, where the same responsibilities lie in this universal agenda. So that would be one of my main conclusions coming out of the 71st session, which is that we need to do a better job of partnership. The UN system has a big role to play in this regard, not just in implementation in the country levels, where we have our army of people in the field in almost every country in the world, but here at the United Nations as well in New York, where partnerships, obviously there are inherent risks, but the rewards from partnerships far outweigh them if we do them right and if we do them strong. So the system needs to take this on, because we won't have the resources, financial resources, innovative resources, if we don't partner up with the best of what's out there in the private sector. So that is one thing that I was saying to member states in there this morning, that we've got to look at a docking system of some sort where we can properly assess partnerships and make them happen, and make sure they're performing to the best that we can in the implementation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The other thing that I was emphasizing in there was the importance of inclusion. And I gave the example of the Ocean Conference as a way that the United Nations can be more inclusive. I mean, basically the doors were open to everybody there, and the private sector and the scientific community and civil society, NGOs, they all felt part of that process. And as a result, we got that massive work plan that came out of the Ocean Conference. I call it a work plan because that's what we're modeling it into at the moment. I've been working with DESA on this for the past couple of months. And in fact, we had our first webinar yesterday of one of the clusters that we're putting together. We're basically clustering that work plan that came out of the Ocean Conference into workable groups going forward. Yesterday happened to be the mangrove community. That was an easy one for us to start with. There were about 50 voluntary commitments on mangroves. And talking to those people in that webinar yesterday, they're hugely keen to continue this collaboration between the UN and civil society, NGOs, scientific community. And they were all represented yesterday. So it looks like a good model going forward to implement that work plan that has come out of the Ocean Conference. And as I was saying to the member states in there today, that's a model which works for SDG 14. It should be something that can work for other SDGs that were perhaps lagging or feeling a bit homeless. Other points that I made in there to the member states today, it's true that the bar is high for the 2030 agenda, but it had to be set high because of the enormous challenges we're facing, and the enormous transformations in systems and behavior that are demanded of us. Not because we've set an agenda, but because the planet and humanity need these changes in systems and behavior. We're pushing planetary boundaries to a point where at some stage in the 21st century we're going to hit a wall if we don't change the way we're doing things. And rather than hit that wall, let's plan our path away from it. And that's what the 2030 agenda is. That's what the Paris Climate Agreement is, and the various mosaic of agreements that we have put in place, from the urban agenda to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and so on. But we have, I think as a UN system, delivered in that regard. We've got a clear plan for humanity, and we are raising the alarm is not quite the right word. I think an early morning wake-up call is probably a better way of putting it. That everybody be aware. You can't just carry on the way we're going on now. And you're seeing it with climate change. The climate change deniers are having a hard time these days when you look at the thousands of lives lost around the world in the last couple of months to floods and tsunamis. Well, tsunamis are not climate change, but to floods and hurricanes and droughts, and it's happening. So what else can I report on what we were talking about in the office there? I mean, I don't think I need to bore you by going through everything that we've done this year, which is basically the way I bored them in there. Because you all saw that stuff happen, the SDG action events that we had on innovation and the SDG financing lab, the one we had on education, the one that we had on climate change, and the first one that we had, if you remember, the sustaining peace relation to sustainable development. And we were going through this morning there with member states the outcomes of all those. Happy to answer questions on any of them. The SDG advocacy work that we did, I was reporting on that along with Ambassador Kamau and Ambassador Williams. I visited 32 countries in every region in the world to push our message on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly trying to broaden it so that it's not just government's national plans, but it's citizens that understand the logic of this, the agenda and the necessity for it. The fact that without the implementation of this agenda, everybody's children and grandchildren are going to have a very tough time of it in the 21st century. So we went out there to do that. You already know that I wrote to all the heads of government in the world asking them to put the SDGs onto school curriculums. A very good response to that. I wrote to 4,000 heads of universities with the same message, and good response to that. So advocacy was there. Dan Thomas and his team put together those SDG media zones, which I thought were very effective. And all of that to burn the candle of enlightenment better and brighter. So that was advocacy, and the generating of collaboration was done through all those special events that we held. Then within the General Assembly there was the implementation of SDG-related matters. There was the Technology Bank for LDCs. There was a resolution passed on that. There was the Global SDG Indicator Framework resolution. Lengthy consultations and more work to be done on the alignment of the GA agenda with the SDG, with the 2030 agenda.
Can you speak louder? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. I've been speaking all morning since 10 o'clock, so the voice is starting to go. And during the session, we were also advancing preparations for the major meetings that are coming up. Work at hand for you guys and for the new PGA next week. These include, of course, migration, big one, human trafficking, and South-South cooperation. So all of that happened. In conclusion, what would I say about the 71st session? There's a lot here. I won't repeat what's here because there is actually a report, an accountability report, which we put on the table of everybody in that meeting room. So you can easily get hold of a copy of that from Dan.
Circulated the report already.
That's been circulated. Okay, so that report is basically an accountability document on what was done in the 71st session in terms of the theme of pushing the implementation of the 2030 agenda. But what do I feel about the 71st session? I look at the Secretary General and I say, first of all, good start. He's got a massive task ahead of him. You look at the challenges of the world. We've talked about climate change, but on the security side, he's got huge work to do there. The development agenda is, as I say, in pretty good shape, I think, at this stage, but needs to scale up. Did the 71st session help him? I think it did. I think it gave him a very good start. You'll remember how he was ushered into office. I think there was huge goodwill from member states as a result of that smooth process. He's now got his executive team in place with Amina Mohammed and Akam Steiner and Mr. Liu from DESA. They're all there, ready to go. So they are going now. There's been a smooth transition, so I think the 71st session achieved that. I think we did, and I say this from the perspective of somebody who was a chair of G77, I think we did have a much more cooperative mentality in the General Assembly this year. The realization, I think, is coming through with everybody that we're all in this together. The 2030 agenda and the Paris Climate Agreement, we all sink or swim together on this. There's nothing like the ocean and the climate system to get that message across to us that, we humans might think we're the all-important thing, but, fish don't recognize our national boundaries. Neither does pollution, neither does ocean acidification, neither does nuclear leaks, and so on. The environment is the fundament in which we operate, and we are starting to see that we have pushed the boundaries of that fundament too far, and that we need to restore respect and balance. So I think that helped the 71st session, that people were starting to realize that, hey, we're all in this together. Why are we spending so much time arguing with each other? So there was that spirit, which I think I tried to instill in everybody, of look ahead. In Fijian, we say Raikiliu. That's sort of one of our national mottos, which is, don't dwell on the past, look ahead. And I think there is that emerging spirit out of the 71st session that people have to look ahead. Why? Because we have to. We're actually in trouble, and you have to look at what's happening down in the Gulf of Mexico and the Leeward Islands and the rest of the Caribbean to see that that is a fact, along with what's happening in Asia and Africa. So, I take that as a positive, the fact that when the going gets tough, we start pulling together, and we're stronger if we are together. So happy to answer some questions.
Great.
Hello, my name is Shauna McGee from Kyoto News, and on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you very much for the past year. We're sorry to see you go, but good luck in the future. I hope you don't mind me asking a question about UN reform, which has been much talked about for decades. We know that you've designated 2 chairs, and there was some movement towards a negotiated text. But looking now on the past year, what movement has there been, in your opinion, and what can we realistically expect down the road in the near future in efforts towards reform?
You're talking about Security Council
I'm
reform?
sorry, yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't say Security Council.
I think every PGA comes into the job and sort of stares into the background and thinks, what the heck am I going to do about this one? Because it is such a Gordian knot. I attempted to pick away at that knot by innovating the 2-chair thing, which I think is a better UN model, and also to make sure that the people that came in were well balanced in terms of the varying views that there are on Security Council reform, and came from areas, in fact, had never been represented in that role before. So all that was good. And I think they both did a fantastic job, by the way. Very consultative, very inclusive. The positions are so well defined now of the various groups. Where do you go from here? I'll be talking privately with Mr. Lajcak on this, and with the Secretary General, as to what can be done. But as it stands, the IGN has to continue in the format with which it is mandated. The P5 obviously have a huge role in this regard because of the Charter, and quite frankly, it's one which I think there's going to have to be a change in the equation somewhere at some stage. But that has to be member state led. But we have a Secretary General who's new in office, and let him get to grips with that. Maybe he has a role to play as well.
James.
James Bays from Al Jazeera. Mr. President, 2 questions, if you don't mind. First, going beyond Security Council reform, you were an ambassador of a relatively small island nation. Now you've held the job of President of the General Assembly. With President Trump convening this meeting on UN reform, what would you be suggesting are the areas he should be looking at, or the UN should be looking at? And the second question, again, a reference to President Trump, because you talked about climate change, you talked about extreme weather events. He pulled out of Paris during your term. He is now facing yet another extreme weather event in his country. What would you say to the US President right now?
Well, first of all, at most of my addresses over the last month, I've spoken strongly in support of the SG's efforts to reform the United Nations. I think it's incumbent on an incoming CEO of an organization that hasn't had major reform for a while, that you address that. I mean, that's especially in an organization like this, which is so big and so siloed in so many ways. You have to address reform, and they've done that. They've put the bit between their teeth on that, addressed that early, and I think that's absolutely right. And so I've supported that wherever I can. I think short-term pain, definitely, always in reform, but long-term gain. So with what President Trump is doing, I quite frankly, I can't really answer that because I haven't seen the letter, but I understand all member states have seen one. So. Remember President Obama, what he did on peacekeeping, it was the same sort of thing. You come to the meeting if you're prepared to support, was basically the formula that, and I went to one of those as an ambassador with my prime minister, and we supported UN peacekeeping, but we wouldn't have been in the door if we hadn't already indicated that we were going to do that. So I think it's the same, as I understand it, similar sort of format for this one on support the SG's reform efforts. It's an important message being sent, of course, to Congress in Washington, who are the biggest providers of funds for the United Nations. That reform is taking place, and I think Ambassador Haley has made it very clear that the whole idea is to show that the American taxpayers that they're getting value for money at the United Nations. So periodic reform is obviously an important part of that. So I think it's entirely rational. On your other one, on what would you say to President Trump on climate change? Well, firstly, deepest sympathies for everybody that's suffering down there in the Gulf, and hopefully Florida won't be too badly hit. But boy, did the Leeward Islands get it, and did they get it bad, And look in India, what happened there. Look at the droughts in Africa. I mean, climate change is happening. You can, deny it till you're the last man on planet who doesn't believe it's happening, even as your house got blown away. But it's happening, and we have to address it. Paris Climate Agreement is our best shot, and we have to stay faithful to it. The American administration is still at the table, of course, and we had very positive signals given to us in the South Pacific about the U.S. administration's willingness to stay engaged in this process. As you know, Fiji, my country, is taking on COP23 this year, and that message was strongly sent to us and has been in the press in Fiji from representatives of the U.S. administration. So the other thing I would say is that the people of the United States, the cities, some of the world leaders on climate action all come from this country. So regardless of the position of a political administration, I do believe that Americans are absolutely committed to this climate action that is necessary, renewable energy and things like that. So that'll be my message.
Let's go over here, Matthew.
Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for this press conference and for what you've done this year to take questions. I wanted to, first of all, on oceans, do you believe that there should be a special representative on oceans? And if so, what would be a process to create one, if you say yes? And the other one has to do is a different aspect of UN reform. This summer I was covering it was called the Eng Lap Seng trial, but it would have been the John Ash trial had he not passed away, rest in peace. But one of the documents introduced was this UN task force report on the PGA's off. It was a task force report prepared by Edmund Millay and others, and it was put into evidence. And one of the quotes is that the task force found that there are no formal agreed common principles of ethical conduct or financial disclosure measures for the president and the personnel of the office, meaning the PGA's office. And I know that you've sort of voluntarily done quite a bit on the website, but how has this critique of even the UN's own task force been addressed? Do you think that there's a need for actually these things to be more than voluntary going forward, with all due respect to the incoming PGA? And what steps would you suggest or propose?
I think that's a really important point. In fact, we've got the GA revitalization resolution this afternoon. It's going through. And I was just looking at my remarks and introducing that, and I was wondering if I should put something about ethics in there, because when I did go to speak to them, I said the ethics is an area which we must have such strong vigilance on in an organization like this. There are crows that pick around the edge of our institution all the time. You see them every day. And we need to have a better ethical system in terms of, who is allowed to even come into our halls. This is a place where giants have trod. This is a place where huge responsibilities for humanity lie. And yet we have some rather dubious characters who are allowed into these halls. And it's not something I enjoy seeing, and I do think that we have to pay particular attention to that. You saw the effects of it with what John Ash, may he rest in peace, got caught up in. In terms of the Moulet report, of course, since then, the General Assembly did take action. When I came into office, I was the first president that had to take this oath of office, which refers to an ethical code, which again, the General Assembly, through its ad hoc working group on geo-revitalization, put in place. And that was a heavily debated thing as to what should be in that code of ethics and what should be in the PGA's oath. So I have been bound by that, and if you come into my office, please come in. I'd love to have a photograph taken in front of it, because anybody who comes to my office does get photographed in it. Both the code of ethics and the oath are on the wall beside the flags. So the PGA's office now is bound by those. And it was the first thing that I showed to Minister Lycek when he came and said, that's us, these two things up there. And all our staff are bound by that as well. So I think we've probably done enough as far as the PGA's office is concerned. There's a lot more to be done in terms of the PGA's office, and that'll stay on the agenda of the ad hoc working group for geo-revitalization. I'd say watch that space, because you can't just keep loading things onto the presidency. But member states can't keep giving these mandates and expect one lady or one man to, assemble enough people around him or her that they can actually carry out those mandates. There has to be more of a secretariat in that office, a permanent secretariat of professionals. Luckily, most PGAs tend to get really good professionals around them. I was certainly very lucky in that regard this year. As to your second question on the Ocean Conference, I would have to hide my head in shame for the rest of my life if we weren't doing follow-up to the Ocean Conference. There was a very strong call from member states for there to be a special representative or a special envoy, and the SG is called upon to take action in that regard. I would expect there to be action. In the meantime, we've set up with UNDESA, who have taken on consultants, the modeling of everything that came out of the Ocean Conference. Modeling it and breaking it down into workable clusters. I am very strong on the fact that we have to meet again in 2020, a second UN conference in 2020. It's got to be mandated by the member states yet, and that's a task at hand. But hey, I'll bet my house on it. If I did have a house, I don't. I would bet my whatever on it, that we will all be getting together in 2020 for our next moment of accountability on SDG 14. Why? Because we're going to shape over the next 3 years everybody that was involved, both the scientific community and the business sector and civil society, as well as UN Oceans, which itself is undergoing review at the moment. We're going to shape everybody to be concentrating on 2020 as the time when we have to deliver on the outcomes of the 2017 conference. And we'll be sharing what those outcomes are, what that work plan is, and everybody is going to be turning up in 2020 and is going to be expected to say, what did we do in the intervening 3 years? And we're going to assess our successes and failures, make the necessary adjustments, and go on to succeed in SDG 14 by 2030. I think, from what I've seen, there is enough unanimity, if that's the word, on this from all sectors that we've got the momentum on SDG 14. I'm not giving up on it, that's for sure.
One last question, yeah.
Yes, Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. Two related questions. First of all, on the issue of reform, I know you indicated strong support for the notion of reforming the UN organization, but can you give some specific examples from your observations over the last year in terms of mandates from the General Assembly? The spokesperson for the Secretary General had just indicated the desire for more flexibility, for example, in HR. Could you just be a little bit more specific there? And secondly, on the budget for your office, could you give kind of a range of what you believe is the shortfall now in supporting a robust office of the PGA, and where do you think that funding should come from? Should it be assessed as part of the regular budget, voluntary, primarily from the country from which the PGA comes from? Could you please elaborate? Thank you.
Yeah, obviously that's going to differ from PGA to PGA, but why should it? Why should a rich country come along with all the staff and money that it needs to run a successful PGA's office? Does it mean we just elect rich countries to do that? I made a commitment to my Prime Minister that I didn't want to be a cost on the Fiji taxpayers. We already overcommit to the United Nations. We make a huge loss on UN peacekeeping and things like that. So I said, look, when I take this presidency, continue to pay me my ambassador's salary. They haven't had an ambassador over in the Fiji mission as a result for this year. They've had a charge d'affaires. And that way there's no change to the budget. And then I went out and raised money from member states, and I hired staff with that money, and I got a lot of secondments of staff and so on. All of this is on the website. Go and have a look at it. In the end, I raised close to $2 million, which were used. Not a lot of that was used for staff. It was mostly secondments in the case of staff. But the money was used up on these, first of all, travel. 32 countries that I sent my envoys out to, Ambassador Kamau, Desmond Williams, myself. But also these SDG action events that I put on, expensive things like that innovation event and so on, all to push that theme. The expenditure was entirely controlled by the UN Trust Fund. Every penny that I raised went into the UN Trust Fund. I think in that post-scandal era that both Ligatov and I came into, it's absolutely essential that the UN Trust Fund had all those funds and disbursed them. So everything is transparently available to any of you that want to dig into those funds, how they were spent. It's all there on the website. So is there and of that, how much do the UN assessed contributions give us of that close to $2 million? I can't even remember. It's tiny though. It's less than 10% of that figure was from given to us. And I think maybe 5 staff were given, and I had 40 staff. It has to be raised if you're talking about a professional secretariat that's going to be there, regardless of who the PGA is, whether they're from rich or poor, that there would be a permanent secretariat there, making sure that there's continuity in the PGA's office, making sure that the standards that we've now set, I think if I think of Ligatov, I'm thinking of transparency. You really set new standards of transparency, which I've had to continue, because obviously you can't go backwards. So the next guy's going to have, and then the next girl's going to have to do that as well. So you set those standards, you can't go back. And in my case, I guess the financial side, the fact that, I did raise a lot of money, but every penny went into the UN Trust Fund. That, again, is a good model to be following, so that, you can all keep track on who's paying for what. You had another question? On reform. Yeah, I think on reform, it's, I've already said what I've said there. Member states have had the reform package put to them now. It's for them now to debate it. They've got until the end of the year to do so. And that will be, no doubt, very closely debated in the various committees over the next few months. Something for you guys to follow while I'm lying on the beach.
Very good. Thank you. I know everyone's hungry. You've been in this room a long time. Should we take one last question, sir?
Last question.
Okay, very good.
Thank you. I have one very short question and then another question. The short question, do you have, sir, any authority on the use of the General Assembly Hall? If the answer is yes, then I have a follow-up.
Okay. That's DGACM's job. DGACM, I have to ask them when I want to use it.
So if the GA is lent to another group to do another activity, it's not you who
Not me.
authorizes it?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
My question is about Myanmar, in fact.
Right.
I mean, the GA was, I didn't hear any strong statement about the atrocities committed in Myanmar. It's almost a genocide taking place, and yet we are waiting for a strong response from the PGA.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, you've heard the response from the person that we have put in place to respond to that, who is the Secretary General. And you've seen his statement. And obviously, we all concur with that. He is our, but I'm the chairman of the board. When the CEO speaks, you're hearing the PGA as well. Our CEO, as Secretary General, is the one who is mandated to make those kind of statements on behalf of the United Nations. We don't want mixed messages. When you hear him speak, that's me as well.
One last question. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. George Baumgarten. Two small questions of, I think, very large import. Number one, following on James's question, whether the climate change agreement, in the absence, however temporary, may prove to be of the United States. And second, with reference to Ambassador Haley's repeated statements about problems with Hezbollah up in Lebanon, what can be done to strengthen UNIFIL, and what can be done, what can they possibly do to stand up to this huge Hezbollah arsenal? Thank you.
Well, it's, what was your first question again?
Climate change.
Climate change. Yeah, on climate change, I regard the U.S. as still at the table, which they are. And, you know, I personally think that things are going to change in terms of the administration's view on climate change as climate change progresses. I personally think that is going to happen. But as to, you know, what's the state of the Paris Climate Agreement, it's going from strength to strength. I mean, when Trump made that announcement, we had meetings here shortly after that, I forget which one, well, the Ocean Conference. People doubled down on their commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement, doubled down. And you can see that. The great mass of humanity is following it. And the great majority of governments that lead us are following it. You know, one country does not break an agreement. I'd remind you, the U.S. is not a signatory of the law of the sea. You know, the great majority of us are. So the sea is run much better as a result of UNCLOS. Same thing with the Paris Climate Agreement. That is where the majority of humanity is putting its faith and its work, and that won't, you know, veer off course because of the recalcitrance of one or two. As to UNIFIL, well, you know, I think you have to face the fact that you can't cut budgets of peacekeeping and expect peacekeepers to do more. You know, there's a balance there. Yeah, get your value for money, but you know, you got to put your money where your mouth is when it comes to peacekeeping.
Very good.
I'm possibly going to have a post-PGA conference before I jump on a plane on Tuesday. I'm a great believer in when you hand over office, you pass the baton and you get out of the race. You don't sort of jog along behind and say, remember me, you know. So I hand over to President Lightcheck on the evening of Monday. Afternoon of Monday in the GA. And then I think we've got a joint reception, sort of Van d'honneur for the transition, and then there's a church service over in Dag Hammarskjöld. After that, my duties are over as PGA. That's Monday. On Tuesday, I'm getting on a plane and flying to an undisclosed island in the Aegean with my wife, where we're going to contemplate each other's navels for about 3 weeks. And that's going to be a secret where that is. But that's 3 weeks of holiday. As you can see from my face, I'm pretty, as we say in my part of the world, buggered. So,
the Security Council reforms,
yeah.
there's a total, it seems to me that there is no way this General Assembly or subsequent General Assembly will ever be able to achieve because of differences between the member states, especially the 5 permanent members. Is there ever going to be, have you made any suggestions that
Were
this...
you here when I answered that question? It was the first
I
question.
know you
answered.
answered it. I'm
Yeah.
saying, is a follow-up question that do you think that there is a possibility that that the General Assembly can somehow muster some?
I think, look, for every human problem, there is a human solution. It's a knot. There's no doubt about it. It's a Gordian knot, but the Gordian knot eventually got untied. What's going to force it, the untying thereof? Just gross unfairness. A whole continent not having permanent membership. That was fine back in the 1950s. It's not fine today. Africa has to have permanent membership of the Council. And there are other countries, of course, which have got their claims as well. But look, I'm a great believer that in this organization and in most organizations, that fairness and logic eventually wins out as long as people are dogged. And the IGN is a dogged process. What is required in the IGN is for people to change their fixed positions. The current equation does not equal a result. It doesn't. There's no way. I've looked at it from 1,000 ways now. It doesn't. So there has to be a new approach. But, that process is member state driven. No Secretary General or individual like me can say, oh, you got to do this or you got to do that. That's not the way. It's got to be a communal thing. I've got some ideas which I'm passing on to those that will be carrying the baton henceforth as to what might be done. But, as it stands, the IGN is where we have mandated, we the member states of this organization have mandated the Security Council reform process to be considered. But I'm going to be making some suggestions about other ways that we could get some progress on that. Because, logic and fairness must in the end prevail.
So I'd like to thank the President for his time and for coming to address you. I'd like to thank you for your support and your interest throughout the year. Thank you very much indeed.